everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's discussion on protecting fundamental rights in the era of AI. My name is Michaela Sullivan-Paul. I'm a senior research officer here at EIPA, the European Institute of Public Administration. We are an organization focusing on building capacity in EU public administrations and are now offering courses and trainings specifically on the topic of artificial intelligence. I'm thrilled to be here to moderate today's timely discussion, and thank you all once again for joining us. By now, we know that AI has the capacity to transform aspects of social, political, and economic life. However, the risks of AI are also on top of mind. For instance, 2024 has marked a significant year for elections, with at least 64 countries taking to the polls around the world, in what many are calling a make or break year for democracy. This has brought concerns over AI's use for generating deepfakes and disinformation to the forefront of decision makers' minds and furthering conversations around AI's influence on democratic practices and values. In a recent message, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that unchecked AI could, and I quote, destabilize democratic systems by spreading disinformation, fueling hate speech, and distorting public opinion through deepfakes. Equally, issues such as bias and discrimination have also been risen, citing the dangers of artificial intelligence, like large language models, being trained on poor and unrepresentative data and resulting in the perpetuation of existing social bias and discrimination. Simultaneously, debates on IP rights and copyright issues have also emerged, raising questions over who owns our data and what right big tech companies have to train AI models on our data, and whether AI outputs can truly be considered original content. Here, we already see how complicated and nuanced the discussion is about AI and how the human experience can either become more clear or more ambiguous in light of AI development. Significant strides have been made to acknowledge the very conditions that make us truly human and the rights that are extended to us in this regard. As the first ever global standards on AI ethics, the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence from 2021 strongly emphasizes the importance of protecting human rights and dignity towards the ethical development, deployment, and use of AI systems. Similarly, the OECD's AI principles include human rights and democratic values like fairness and privacy, and promote such values as foundations for trustworthy AI. These principles are equally present in the EU AI Act, a recently adopted EU legislation that uses a risk-based approach to protect individuals in the EU who are confronted with complex AI systems. So as we shift into a phase of implementation with the EU AI Act, experts such as European MEP Axel Voss and former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi are calling for more emphasis on economic growth and investment in AI development to allow the EU to benefit from AI. Nevertheless, the age-old question of how do we foster innovation while protecting citizen safety persists, and AI is by no means an exception, leaving us with this question: how do we protect fundamental rights in an era of AI? So to help us answer this question, we welcome a panel of distinguished experts within their field, here to represent NGOs, EU institutions, academia, and the private sector. Over the course of the next hour and a half, we will discuss the state of affairs with regards to AI governance, given the advancements in the last month alone, and how these advance values of fundamental rights. We will begin with a short round of introductions where our speakers will get the chance to briefly introduce themselves and the work they are advancing relating to this topic. We will then move into our segment where we will pose questions directly to our panelists relating to the state of affairs on AI and fundamental rights, innovative approaches for promoting trustworthy AI, and also promoting principles of fundamental rights in AI development. For this, panelists will have approximately 4 minutes to answer their questions. And during this session, we hope at some point to pause for some audience engagement if time permits. Otherwise, we will have a designated Q&A session at the end of the segments. As such, we kindly ask our audience to please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function throughout the entire session so that we can then address these later. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panelists, starting with David Reichel, who's a project manager at the European Agency for Fundamental Rights, working in the data and digital sector, and is responsible for managing FRA's work on artificial intelligence and online content moderation. David, thank you so much for joining us. We also have Corinne Canoons, who is the European Executive Director at the CAIDP, the Center for AI and Digital Policy Europe. Thank you so much for joining us, Corinne. We also have Anastasia Stensenko, who is the co-founder of Pliais, an AI company focusing on energy-efficient, industry-specific large language models. Anastasia, thank you for joining us. And last, but certainly not least, Andy Sanchez, who is a senior research in human-centric digitalization at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Andy, great to have you. Panel, thank you so much for joining us in today's discussion. I want to go ahead and jump right in to allow you to do a quick round of introductions for our audience. I hope we can keep this short. Let's try to aim for about 2 minutes. And I'm going to go ahead and start with David. David, please take the floor.
Good morning, or Mahlzeit, how we would say here in Vienna at this time of the day. Thank you for having me at this relevant session. As an opening pitch, fundamental rights, as they are enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, they can be considered as basic rules, how our societies should function. And protecting those rights in an area of AI, artificial intelligence, is for sure more challenging, but of course possible. So I work for the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. Our mandate is to provide so we have EU agency, and our mandate is to provide the EU institutions and member states with data and analysis on fundamental rights issues. And here I work in the data and digital sector, where we have been engaged in this AI-related policy discussions for quite some years. I think it started around 2017, 18. And we're, for example, joining also this high-level expert group on AI in 2018 that started to develop ethical and fundamental rights considerations in the run-up to the AI Act. We published a couple of reports, one called Getting the Future Right in 2020, another one on bias in algorithms in 22. They're running several further more projects at the moment. As a sort of opening pitch, I want to mention that a lot of discussions around AI are quite abstract. They're often linked to science fiction discussions of considering AI as sort of an entity that can do something on its own. And this is a problem because it is always important to consider that there's always a human behind any system that is used. And a system as such cannot make any decisions on its own. It's 2 points that we always try to promote in these discussions from the agency's perspective. So the one is, of course, to promote a rights-based approach. Fundamental rights as such guarantee a human-centric perspective on the use of AI, because that's a commonly agreed frame. And secondly, an evidence-based approach. This helps avoiding abstract discussions, but rather use evidence on concrete use cases on AI that can really further the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And I really look forward to discussing this further in today's panel. I'm going to move over to Corinne next. Corinne, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, so thank you very much, EIPA, for the invitation. So again, Corinne Cohn, I'm the Executive Director of the Center for AI and Digital Policy Europe, CAIDP Europe, which is a European branch of CAIDP, which is a non-profit research and advisory organization which aims to promote a better society, more fair, more just, a world where technology promotes broad social inclusion based on fundamental rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So basically, our mission aligns pretty much with the one of the Fundamental Rights Agency, except that we come from the perspective of the civil society. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the CAIDP flagship report, the AI and Democratic Values Index, which assesses the public policies of 80 countries in the world. And I have served as an AI law and policy expert for the UNESCO or the OECD, and represented CAIDP in the negotiation of the Council of Europe Convention on AI. I'm also happy to announce that CAIDP Europe will be participating in the drafting of the EU General Purpose AI Code of Practice, which will be drafted to implement the EU AI Act provisions regarding general purpose AI models, such as large language models, and the ones you mentioned, which are tricky with regard to election discrimination and so on and so forth. And I must say that CSOs and rights holders will only represent 11% of the participants into this drafting process. So we do have to work together to make sure systemic risks to fundamental rights are meaningfully addressed in the drafting of the JPI code. So obviously, the theme of today's panel, protecting fundamental rights in the era of AI, is right at the heart of CIDP and CIDP Europe's mission. And I'm very happy to be with you today. And I think that what the title of the session highlights is that we should really make sure that the same rights are ensured online and offline. It is not because suddenly we have these new technological developments that fundamental rights protection should be put into questions. On the contrary, we should make sure that it is ensured. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And what you're saying gives me a lot of hope. Congratulations so much on the CIIDP's involvement on the drafting of the codes of practice. More to be discussed later. Next, I'm going to move over to Anastasia. Anastasia, would you like to take the floor, please?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm Anastasia Stasenko. I'm a co-founder of Playas, which is a startup specialized in pre-training large language models and vision language models. And the specificity of what we are doing is, well, consistent actually following the already existing regulations such as GDPR, as well as AI Act, and basically only training our models on content with permissive licenses. So we do not train our models on common crawl, which extensively contains private information and personal data, which is impossible to fully filter out. And we do not train on copyrighted content, which is a fit. Because we need to work through open data, open science, public domain works in order to create the consistent and big enough corpus to achieve the state-of-the-art performance of our models. And we are going to release our first 3 billion parameters model this October, which will be on par, at least as our current tests show, with the state-of-the-art models of the similar size. So that basically shows that following the regulation and following the, let's say, the regulatory constraints which support the fundamental rights and the interests of the wider range of stakeholders is actually not a threat to innovation, but something that can actually boost it more, since we have to go and find new resources for data and new ways of actually optimizing the performance, which are not, let's say, lay only in scale of actual scaling of compute resources. Playas is also part of the working group of the GPAA code of practice as the provider of general purpose models. So we will be working along such providers as OpenAI, etc. So we'll be trying to push a little bit further in terms of actually following the provisions of AI Act on copyright and transparency of training data. So hopefully there will be a little bit more of, let's say, probably opening and the willingness to actually go with these provisions by the economic actors as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. And I probably speak on behalf of others, but I'm very happy to have you here with your technical insights as well, because I have less of a technical background, but also to represent kind of the innovation that's happening right here in Europe and in your case in France. So really great to have you. And we're going to conclude, of course, not by any means last, but we have Andy Sanchez. Please, Andy, if you'd like to take the floor and introduce yourself.
Of course. And first and foremost, thanks so much to EIPA for inviting me. And I'm really excited and honored to be among such great panelists doing amazing work. So thanks to all of you as well for your efforts. I'm Andy Sanchez. I am a senior researcher in human-centric digitalization at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. In this role, I'm heavily focused on interdisciplinary methods, but in particular, understanding how AI gets understood and enacted in human environments, in particular in the workplace. Right now, we're leading a project across 17 different industries. They're piloting different AI-driven technologies, and we're studying how rights and well-being are understood, supported, or challenged by these technologies, how trust and adoption is facilitated by the mechanisms that management, the technology, and the workers, how all these different actors interrelate. Before this role, I was a senior researcher for the AI Futures Lab at TU Delft here in the Netherlands, as well as a senior researcher for the Sustainable Media Lab in Holland. In these roles, I focused more heavily on two things. One was how human rights and how digital human rights are manifested. So going back to Corinne's point about equating and matching our rights in online spaces versus offline spaces, but also heavily focused on digital literacy. So in that capacity, I stood up an international consortium dedicated to electoral resilience and digital literacy, particularly, as Michaela, you mentioned, in this significant election year. So we developed an exhibition full of interactive and playful installations to help folks understand the impact of AI on democracy. We toured Europe ahead of the European parliamentary elections. That meant that we went to The Hague, then to Brussels, then to Berlin, and then finally to Amsterdam. We headed to the UK ahead of their summer elections, and we're heading to the US ahead of their November elections. And our goal here was really to focus on playful and accessible ways to understand the power and limitations and impacts of AI. And one of the things that I'd like to focus on for my contribution to this discussion would be one, who's involved in these discussions, a real sense the interdisciplinarity and connection between different stakeholders on these topics. And two, what are the rights that are understood in this space? Which rights do we focus on in the sense of which other rights? And how does digital literacy play a role in that? But I'll pass it back to you, Michaela, to get us started. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Andy. I really appreciate what the points that you made, both about kind of establishing trust, but also AI literacy. And I think very much these two go in hand. And I do hope we get the chance to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that as we go forward. Thank you all so much for your introductions. I really think the diversity of this panel in particular is going to deliver some really interesting insights and considerations for our audience. So thank you once again. So let's go ahead. Let's jump right into our first round of questions. So as I've already mentioned, 2024 has been a significant year for AI governance. I think we can all agree on this. But the last month alone, in September, we have seen such an increase in activity in this regard. So, for example, we have the International Framework Convention on AI and Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law, which was first signed by its first signatories on the 5th of September, I believe, quickly followed by the G20 and their digital economy working group's declaration on digital inclusion for all, which was published a couple weeks later. Then we had the UN's final report on governing AI for humanity that was quickly followed by the UN's Global Digital Compact, which was adopted during the Summit of the Future. All of this, of course, was predated by the EU AI Act, which is a landmark AI regulation, which was published officially into the EU official journal the 12th of July of this year alone. So with this in mind, my first question goes to Corinne. Corinne, as the European Director, the Center for AI and Digital Policy in Europe has been vital in consulting on and contributing to many of the AI frameworks and initiatives that have already been mentioned. You also notably have your own publications. As you mentioned, we have the AI and Democratic Values Report, and also more recently, the Future is Now, AI and the Legal Profession Report. Based on your extensive work and coverage relating to AI governance, how does one orient themselves in a rapidly evolving environment of AI governance? Where do we see initiatives such as the Framework Convention and the Declaration of Digital Inclusion for All and the EU AI Act? Where do we see these converge on principles and values of fundamental rights, if at all? And where do we still see some potential gaps in which fundamental rights might still be at risk? Just a reminder, we have 4 minutes, but I'll pass it over to you, Karim. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a huge topic, but if I may, I would say I would like to flip the perspective around and say that fundamental right protection and the human-centric approach to AI are the answer to all these questions. Fundamental right protection and human-centric AI are and should be our louder star in navigating a rapidly evolving technological and AI governance ecosystems. All the different perspectives have to be integrated, and I think this is the beauty of the panels that you've organized today with very different perspectives and participants. So if I may, as explained by UNESCO in its comment on the G20 Ministerial Declaration on Digital Inclusion for All, safe, secure, and trustworthy AI, when applied in a transparent, ethical, responsible, and reliable manner, may act as a catalyst for achieving economic growth and inclusive sustainable development within its 3 dimensions: social, economic, and environmental. So only if we address the threats to fundamental social and environmental rights can AI innovative power truly be unleashed for the good of all. So in reality, it means also that there is no balancing act between fundamental right protection on the one hand and innovation on the other hand, but rather a sequencing and an iterative process. And I think that concretely speaking, we will see this. There are concrete consequences to that. From a human-centric perspective, all existing frameworks and policy frameworks are complementary. Concretely speaking, the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI builds on earlier initiatives such as the OECD G20 AI principle or the Universal Guidelines on AI. Very recently, at least in July, the Global Partnership on AI Ministerial Council held in New Delhi announced an integrated partnership between the Global Partnership on AI and the OECD. The Council of Europe Framework Convention on AI, the first binding international treaty in the field, has been signed and can be signed by any states in the world. And for example, the US have already signed it. And if I may, from a new perspective, the EU, this means also because the EU is a signatory and will highly likely ratify this convention, the EU Act will have to be interpreted in the light of the Council of Europe AI Treaty. So although the EU Act is a market regulation, its human-centric dimension will be further reinforced. So the question is why this international cooperation efforts to tackle the risks posed by AI are necessary. And here I would also like to quote the UN final report on governing AI for humanity that you mentioned. AI governance regimes must span the globe to be effective. Effective in building trust, averting AI arms races and races to the bottom on safety and rights, responding effectively to challenges arising from the transboundary character of AI. So instead of gaps, to answer your question, it might be worth thinking in terms of convergence. There is first a clear convergence among all these frameworks in terms of content. So we can notice a clear impetus towards a holistic approach to AI regulation that protects and promotes fundamental rights, democratic institutions, and the rule of law. For example, the UNESCO recommendation on the ethic of AI has been a catalyst of this. They have been working with different states to have a to develop human-centric national AI strategies. There should be clear guardrails and red lines, whether in the UNESCO recommendation or the EU Act, there are red lines such as social scoring, for example, and the aim is to enable AI innovation and maximize its benefits to society. There is also a will to foster transparency and meaningful public participation. And we are also witnessing around the world the evolution of data protection regime. Of course, in the EU, we do have the GDPR, but other countries are looking at how they can improve their data protection regimes. And I must say that the advent of general purpose AI, ChatGPT, and the like, large LLM models have reignited this question in the positive sense of somehow in the negative sense, if we look at the Mario Draghi's report, since there is an issue of whether we should, for the sake of interoperability, that the GDPR should be revised. However, the last report from the second report of the Commission on the GDPR noticed that there is no reason to revise the GDPR. And last but not least, another key issue is liability and accountability measures that are being discussed and planned, along with independent oversight, empowered to investigate and enforce international frameworks and also national and European regulations. So there is also, apart from this convergence in terms of content, a convergence in terms of representation, because as we know, we have already 2 UN resolutions on AI. The UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI has been endorsed by 193 countries in the world. And as I mentioned, there has been various partnerships, JPI, G20, G7, OECD, and Council of Europe. And this is why they should be interpreted in as converging towards the protection of fundamental rights. And last but not least, then there is a convergence in terms of coordination, implementation, and enforcement. So to give just 2 examples, with regard to ChatGPT and the large language models, we saw that there has been global privacy assembly resolutions. The red are Ibero-American networks of data protection authorities have been investigating ChatGPT, and the Colombian Data Protection Authority has been particularly investing ChatGPT. We have the same in the US with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And of course, we had Italy, who imposed as a data protection authority in Italy, which imposed a temporary ban on ChatGPT to see how it would be functioning. And there has been a position delivered by the European Data Protection Board. And the last but not least, we will see what happens when the national market surveillance authorities will be all set up in the framework of the EU Act. So I tried to cover a lot in a very limited amount of time. I'm happy we can discuss further after if there are some questions. Thank you.
And I very much appreciate that, Corinne. I know 4 minutes is not nearly enough to tackle such a large question, but I really do appreciate you kind of taking us on a journey on all of these different frameworks, and then also emphasizing kind of the role of market surveillance authorities within the EU context and how they're going to play a really significant role with regards to enforcement and compliance. And staying on this trend on the EU AI Act specifically, I do have a question for David next. With regards to the European Fundamental Rights Agency, one could argue that its importance has grown even more through its designated seat on the AI Advisory Forum, in which, alongside other stakeholders like ENISA or Senelec or the ETSI, the FRA can really play an active role in ensuring that fundamental rights are a priority in AI compliance within the EU context. I know the work on the AI Advisory Forum has yet to really begin. However, could you tell us a little bit more about how the FRA is well positioned to serve the the Advisory Forum rather? And as we prepare for additional guidance and processes from the EU AI Office, whether it's on these codes of practice, as we've already mentioned, or maybe on the fundamental rights impact assessment, which hopefully we'll get to talk about a little bit later, where do you see the Advisory Forum playing a key role in promoting fundamental rights in AI compliance as we move forward?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. Let me start off by saying that the technology we understand under AI is a technology that can be used in all areas of life, and as a consequence can impact on all fundamental rights in one way or the other. Obviously also in a positive way, but of course we are concerned with a negative impact as well. So it can impact on privacy of people and data protection, the granularity of data, increased analysis of data that allows us to much easier interfere with the privacy of people. So that's one of the major challenges. Secondly, Non-discrimination is one of the core discussions. We all know that the use of automated systems of algorithms can either simply continue to treat people in a disadvantaged way. It can exacerbate discrimination even, or even create it from scratch. So discrimination is one of the core areas of concern as well. And lastly, also like these are the three areas we highlighted in one of our reports, is access to an effective remedy and fair trial. Especially the use of opaque AI systems that are not fully understood makes it difficult for people to challenge certain decisions. And these are the three areas, at least to start with, to address from a fundamental rights perspective, but of course acknowledging that all rights can be impacted in one way or the other. The AI Act now adopted has one of its purposes is to protect fundamental rights. That's as it says in Article 1. The purpose of the regulation is to improve, of course, the functioning of the internal market on the one hand, to promote the uptake of AI, but while ensuring a high level of protection to health, safety, and fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter. So one of the purposes of this law is also to protect fundamental rights. Now, how to use and work on the AI Act? Fundamental rights safeguards are included at various places in the AI Act. It's important to understand the structure. Let me just highlight a few of relevance. One, for example, is Article 9 in the AI Act, which includes risk management systems for providers of AI, those who are putting AI systems on the market. They have to identify and analyze known and reasonably foreseeable risks of high-risk AI systems. So, of course, that's just for only a selected of high-risk AI systems, the risk they can pose to health, safety, and fundamental rights. And so here providers already have to look into this issue. They also have to pay due consideration to children, for example, and other vulnerable groups. And that's an important article to look out for. There are also others. Article 10 on data governance is relevant. Article 11 on technical documentation to increase transparency. Article 14 on human oversight and so forth. One more I want to highlight is Article 77, which we like a lot. So it's an article that allows access to documentation for national bodies protecting fundamental rights. So when fundamental rights institutions in member states exercise their mandate, they may also access this kind of information that was drawn up by providers. And lastly, of course, importantly, there's Article 27, the Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment that is limited to public administration and those working for public administration and for some selected private companies like those, for example, assessing creditworthiness of people. So we have provisions to work with in the AI Act. When it comes to the concrete questions of the advisory forum, so the AI office is in the process of setting up the entire governance structure of the AI Act, as it was only recently adopted, will be one of the 5 permanent members of this forum, and the forum will provide additional advice and technical expertise to the European AI Board and the European Commission. And as you already mentioned, it should reflect the views of industry, academia, civil society in a balanced manner. So we welcome, of course, to have a role on this forum and look forward to cooperating with the other members of the board and the commission on this. But as you hinted already, so it is still in the process of being set up. I think it's scheduled for the end of this year to get more concretely. So I can't share much more now on ways of how this will work, except that we welcome it and will embrace our role there. What is relevant, of course, in this cooperation in general is what we highlighted for years, is that interdisciplinary cooperation and stakeholder engagement is crucial when addressing fundamental rights risks of AI. And here the forum seems also a good place to have this engagement. But of course, there's not just the advisory forum, there's more work for the agency in this area. We are running several research projects looking more concretely into different areas of high-risk AI, talking to providers, deployers, and seeing how like it is to implement the AI Act on some of the provisions and how to protect fundamental rights. Also like seeing similarities and differences across different high-risk areas like education, employment, migration, and law enforcement. So with our projects, of course, we're looking to contribute to the fundamental rights impact assessment under the AI Act, the questions to be developed there. It is also important to mention that there's work ongoing, as you said, with Senelec on the standardization of certain of the aspects for providers' obligations under the AI Act. We'll see how much the agency can also contribute to these discussions. And the list goes on of things, how we can contribute there, but unfortunately, we are also limited in resources, and this way have to be selective on how we can, where we can contribute and where not. But much work ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It definitely sounds like the work of the advisory forum is cut out for them. There's a lot to be accomplished, but I definitely think it's a good place for us to continue watching, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes of the advisory forum as well. We've already kind of established some of the mechanisms and the provisions that have been created and initiated to be able to protect fundamental rights in the era of AI. But I also want to ensure that we can kind of explore how AI might be a useful tool for fostering or advancing values of fundamental rights, not just as a risk or a violation of them. And so for this, I turn into the second session where I call on Anastasia. So Anastasia, given your experience developing AI models, both for the public and private sectors, you've made it a mandate of your new enterprise at PLAES to develop robust and trustworthy AI applications by democratizing access to information, whether it's through synthetic data or through cultivating and organizing open data, for example. So how do you see opportunities for AI technologies to foster and enable fundamental rights values rather than solely as a technology that could infringe or violate these rights? And again, reminder, 4 minutes if we could. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question, because indeed, as was said earlier, we are seeing lots of conversation about the security threats and the threats of AI to fundamental rights, which are, some of them are very much, obviously reasonable, and others are a little bit exaggerating and presenting the current models as some kind of AGI, which they are definitely not. And at PLAES, we are seeing, I'd say, two main directions where current AI technologies, and I would talk specifically about generative AI, could actually be vectors of empowerment and of further promotion of fundamental rights. The first one is education, and the second one is access to information, which could be rendered more discoverable and more accessible to wider range of population. I'll talk first about the second direction, because we have been seeing this this trend, and we have been contributing to it, also working with open data and open science. Basically, open data and open science programs and initiatives across the world have been suffering for a long time from the lack of discoverability. Basically, you have lots of funds being invested in making the data available, right? In this hope that basically citizens, organizations, well, civil society in general would basically have this access and they would do something with data. However, this doesn't happen, and this for quite obvious and simple reason. It's not enough to kind of throw away data and hope that people will do something about it and will get empowered by it and will use it for their applications, but you actually also need to give sufficient tools so that non-specialists and people without any kind of data science backgrounds, which is and still will be the majority of the population, well, don't have, basically, could work with this data and turn it into profit for their use in different applications, which could be both educational or any kind, basically even agricultural ones. Multiple applications are possible. And here what we are seeing is that we could actually have AI systems allow the better discoverability of open data and open science. However, the threat here, well, not the threat, but let's say the risk here is to not to build the open systems for semantic search on open data or open science, and simply rely on what biggest AI providers do offer at the moment. And this is something that the European Commission has been working on quite a lot by publishing a couple of public tenders to basically establish the data exchange platforms and the instruments for better data discoverability, calling on actors who would develop open source technologies which could be adopted by a wider range of stakeholders without basically feeding also their own data to the EIPA providers. And on our side, in this sense, we have been working on even local AI solutions for working, for example, with research, with scientific publications, basically developing document processing local assistance that you can deploy on your own devices. Your personal computer, be it Mac or Windows, or on phones, which is kind of the device that let's say we are more targeting, because it would include much wider populations as well. And to allow working through these massive amounts of documents in order to discover something that could be of real use and interest to your own application locally, without sharing any of your data or any information on your usage. So here I'm quite hopeful, and we are happy to be part of Mozilla Foundation accelerator program, which actually boosts this, which actually has the objective of boosting this kind of local use of AI, which could empower citizens and civil society stakeholders around the globe to both appropriate themselves these tools and use it for working with massive amounts of data without necessarily having any kind of data science skills. And the second direction that I'm very hopeful about is education. And here, once again, well, this direction presents both multiple opportunities and some risks, because if we don't work on making AI technologies more available, specifically in the global south now, there could be a huge educational gap that arises from it, and it would be even worse than the digital gap that we have seen emerge since last 20 years. So on our side, we have been partnering with an NGO called Libraries Without Borders, and developing on device, and this we're talking about phones, on-device AI educational assistance, where what we actually technically needed to do here is basically develop AI models which are much smaller than current ones, but which still working well, meaning not hallucinating, following the databases, like let's say the ground truth that we feed to them, right? And it's not an easy fit, and what we do really lack is both funding for actually fundamental research on this kind of miniaturizing of AI models and their efficient deployment on devices. And we do also lack the help, let's say, in implementation phase, because, well, you actually need to gather actors who would be able to test it by small, let's say, focus groups, because we cannot target massive deployment of these tools without prior testing, extensive testing. And this is something that is not really easy, but that we are currently developing in a small scale project in Senegal by the frontier health workers, for whom we are developing this educational assistant to provide them with better gynecological training. So yeah, so those are the directions that I'm very much hopeful about, but there are indeed multiple let's say multiple risks that I believe could be only overcome with the let's say more intensive involvement by also the institutional actors as well as economic ones, which are today not really interested, as from what I'm seeing, in working on such kind of social impact and citizen empowerment projects as some of what we have been, for example, developing.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. And indeed, it's saddening to hear that perhaps the interest may not be there, but perhaps as we see the implications of this widening AI literacy gap and the dangers that are associated with that emerge more so, hopefully there will be more work like yours trying to close that gap. And I think this relates nicely to our next question, which is targeting Andy here, who really, your work, Andy, has done quite a lot to accomplish with regards to kind of exploring how individuals interact and consume and exchange information both on and offline. And one of your projects in particular provides a space designed to foster human AI interactions and provides a more kind of dynamic AI learning experience. So based on your research and the outcomes of this project, what does AI and human interactions tell us about our path towards trustworthy AI? How can AI technologies be used to achieve and foster these notions like AI literacy and AI awareness? And why is it so important for ensuring fundamental rights in light of AI development? Thanks, Andy.
Absolutely. There are two parts I want to respond to here. And I know we want to keep it brief, so I'll try to be brief. But the first part is about design and innovation. And this is echoing Corinne's point about how while it is frequently viewed in opposition, innovation does not have to be at odds with fundamental rights. And I want to call out and highlight, like the great work that Anastasia is doing with players regarding accessibility and how data is used. There are lots of innovative design practices that utilizing AI that really secure fundamental rights. So I'm thinking about things like design theories like design for resistance, where advocates and activists on the ground are utilizing their own designs to facilitate their right to assembly, their right to protest. Similarly, we can look at design for justice, where we think about who is involved in the design process, and in particular, highlighting, supporting, and maximizing marginalized voices, voices from LGBTQ communities, voices from the differently able communities, and how these can reshape technology and also are themselves innovations that are pushing towards fundamental rights. And it's important for us in these hype narratives around AI to not lose sight of this fact that innovation does not have to be at the expense of fundamental rights. And that brings me to my second point, which is about education and literacy. I'll talk about this a little bit in the classroom environment, but mostly I'd like to focus on the project that you mentioned. At the university level, it's very interesting, and Anastasia, you make a great point about the education gap across socioeconomic levels. An interesting sub-challenge there even within European contexts, right, is we're seeing students who are not in technical backgrounds feeling that gap themselves. They're also expressing this fear that in 5 years, in 10 years, their job, their skills, all of the critical thinking that we're equipping them with will be obsolete. This is a particular concern for law students, where they really develop this amazing expertise to synthesize data that frankly can be automated in a pretty comparable way. We're obviously not there yet, but that's an interesting challenge. And so what it brings up for me, and an important thing to consider in design and these kinds of conversations, is the social and emotional context in which AI is experienced on the individual level, right? So this affects the classroom, this affects how students learn, this affects what they want to see, but it also beyond the classroom just affects this, it adds to this hype narrative, right? So we get, as Anastasia mentioned, talking about AGI, where we're thinking about fully autonomous, fully these AI systems that can just do anything, that can think on their own, which is not anywhere near what our technical capacity is at, and nor is it where we should be thinking, because these AI systems that are being deployed in the real world are having human rights impacts, are having major impacts on individuals' lives. And what we see in the project that I did is a real challenge to combat these narratives. So folks will come in to our exhibition, which is, again, it's an immersive space where we're thinking about the impact of AI and democracy. And one of our principal goals was to think about how do we make these interactions playful? Because we saw that as a key way to stimulate engagement, curiosity, and critical thinking, in particular because a lot of these issues become rapidly political and individuals can feel like they're being attacked, whether it's a political campaign that they support is being highlighted or something like this. So it's a real challenge to get into meaningful educational moments there. And we saw playfulness as a way to do that. And what that allowed, one was a lot of laughter and joy and smiles, and that's what we saw, but also is a calming effect. There's a very interesting way in which they realized, oh, the AI sometimes doesn't get it right. And that actually gave them a lot of reassurance and I think changed their perception about what needs to be addressed. And I think that they became, as they went through the exhibition, many of our participants became very interested in noticing where the shortcomings were and how they could identify them. And I think offering, having engagement and educational opportunities that really facilitate this kind of self-motivated critical thinking, of reevaluation of these so hyped up, all-powerful AI myths that we have in our minds and the broader public are really important to shifting this conversation to fundamental rights and to a natural balance between innovation and fundamental rights.
Thank you so much. And I completely agree. I mean, taking this approach that can be maybe a little bit more lighthearted or a curiosity-driven approach to building AI literacy and interaction, rather than really feeding into these narratives, can be a really effective way of addressing some of the fears concerned with AI. But there are, of course, some topics that necessitate a really serious kind of tone and consideration towards it. And I think that brings us into our next session on promoting principles of fundamental rights, but in AI development. And Andy, I'm going to bounce this one right back to you. But in addition to some of the projects you've already mentioned, your research also really addresses the human rights impacts of AI technologies, exploring the implications of things like biometric surveillance and facial recognition technology, for example. So how do you see the tension between the growing use of biometric systems, such as facial recognition? How do you see this be balanced against the right to privacy? And as these evolve, and the long-term kind of human rights implications of this becomes more pronounced, what are some of the key kind of human rights challenges that policymakers and the public should be prepared for in the coming years, particularly regarding notions of privacy and fairness and transparency, as you've touched on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things that's interesting to me is how this conversation gets framed a lot. So I think you're absolutely right to bring up questions about privacy, fairness, and transparency. But I think it is also notable that the fundamental rights we talk about a lot in digital spaces, and in particular with regards to AI, really center on the freedom, the right to privacy or freedom of expression. Even though we see impacts on a wider range of fundamental rights. We see impacts on the right to assembly, impacts on the right to self-expression. We see impacts across the range of human experience, because this goes back to David's point about how these technologies are being integrated across disciplines, across the different areas that we interact with in our lives. So it really is impacting a breadth of fundamental rights. And I think that is a key point that I hope is centered in the conversation that we have as we're continuing to codify and regulate AI in a more meaningful way. The other thing I want to touch on, so I think that this, because when we think of these sorts of consolidated and monopolistic or oligarchical ways in which the technology industry holds quite a bit of power, you see them driven towards these exploitative practices that are often seeing our data, our privacy, our usage as elements, as things that they can meaningfully challenge how we see privacy in connection with these technologies. I think my connection is getting a little unstable. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It got
if
a
you
little
lost me
bit
there.
blurred there, but if you see it happening, maybe just shut off your camera. But for now, I think we're okay.
All right, thanks so much, and I'll pass it to you for the second.
Okay, understood. Sorry about that, Andy, but thank you so much. Then we'll move on to our next question then, and this one is for David. Now that we're kind of shifting into this phase of implementation with the EU AI Act and other regulatory measures like the DSA and the DMA and the already mentioned GDPR as well, all of which are really have kind of strong provisions for protecting fundamental rights. You kind of mentioned this earlier, but this opaque and very poorly understood, like black boxed nature of many AI systems can make it extremely difficult to ensure that these rights are truly respected in practice. And so my question to you is, how can we ensure that AI developers and companies go beyond compliance just on paper and are genuinely integrating things like transparency and accountability and non-discrimination into the development of AI systems, especially when the inner workings of these systems are not totally understandable for us, but even for the developers themselves sometimes?
Thank you. Yeah, that's again a very good question and an important one. You may have heard there's a joke that says the term algorithm is used by developers if they don't want to say what they did. That's obviously a joke, but there's some truth to it. And all of you know the phrase, the computer says no. That's not acceptable justification for decisions that impact on people's lives. Period. So opaque systems are one of the core problems of AI. And as you were saying, very often people say, yeah, but AI, that's very complicated. We can't understand it. Again, for certain decisions, this is not acceptable. But here, of course, it depends on the context. And that's why there's also like different levels of risks. For example, a spam filter, we all know or don't know how it works. We also don't care as long as I don't get spam in my inbox and I don't see any major problems coming up there. That's different when it comes to hate speech detection and filtering online, for example. This is not that straightforward. We, for example, tested some of these hate speech detection algorithms for biases, and we can see that they easily overreact to certain terms for certain groups, like when the term Muslim appears or Jew. They even like inoffensive content will be detected as being offensive. And the other way around, for some other groups, it entirely misses out because the systems are biased. So here we, of course, need to get a better understanding of how these systems work in order to understand and assess if they are fit for purpose. So what can we do about it? The good news is, of course, we can understand how AI works to the extent that is needed. And the key to this is transparency and the description of the processes, because there's really nothing that prevents a developer and deployer of AI to describe the systems. And here, I mean, we provided some guidance in our reports and how this can be done. I think it's well also reflected in Article 11 of the AI Act, the documentation requirements. And, it starts with describing the purpose of the system, the context of the system. What decisions, what output was it optimized for? What technology was used? You don't even need to go much into detail there, but what the training data were used to develop the tool? What kind of assessments were done on accuracy across different groups and so forth? So doing this, we've already come quite far and get at least a grasp of how the systems work in practice and where the risks are. And then, of course, that's the precondition to do a risk management system, set up a risk management system, or doing a fundamental rights impact assessment. So as I mentioned, we have several running projects on assessing high-risk AI, on remote biometrics, identification, on digitalization of justice as well. And the AI Act has provisions, as I just mentioned, that can help and will help to increase the transparency of AI systems, and this way also mitigate some of the risks. But of course, also, as you mentioned, there are more. There's not just the AI Act. We have more laws that are out there to safeguard fundamental rights, and they can also be used well, like the GDPR It has very good provisions that also help when it comes to automated decision making. We need to provide meaningful information about the logic involved in this processing. So here we can also expect from those using the systems to describe what they did. Of course, there's also challenges. We published a report before summer on data protection authorities' experiences with the GDPR, showing that their lack of resources really also hampers sometimes the way they can work in this area. Another important law is the Digital Services Act. It tackles the very large online platforms and online communication. There's a lot of good transparency provisions as well. It's currently in the implementing phase. So here we also need to see how this works in practice. The Fundamental Rights Agency is also about to start a new project there to provide more guidance on what freedom of expression and non-discrimination means in the context of very large online platforms. So we have a lot of tools that we are now in the implementation phase. As a last point, and then I'll stop to answer concretely your question. What we learn from our research on the ground is that often companies and developers really want to do it right. They just don't know how. So the good guidance on the ground on what you have to do to get it right is key for the next phases to protect fundamental rights.
Thank you so much, David. That's a really great point. Is as we await, we're kind of in this a little bit of a gray area where we know more information and more guidance will be available. But until then, we're doing the best that we can to ensure compliance. But I think on this note, we can turn over to Anastasia, who's going to have some really great insights on this with regards to protecting fundamental rights in practice. And so, Anastasia, my question for you is, Mario Draghi's recent report has been making quite some headlines with some key consideration really paid to the digital transformation, in which he specifically states, and I quote here, "While the ambitions of the EU's GDPR and AI Act are commendable, their complexity and risk of overlaps and inconsistencies can undermine development in the field of AI by EU industry experts." So given your specialization in designing and implementing trustworthy AI models for both the public and private sectors, what are your reactions to Draghi's statement? Where do you notice possible challenges for providers of AI systems attempting to conform to the EU AI Act, but equally other frameworks of ethical AI? And we've alluded to this already, but I still also want to ask you in particular, how do we balance principles of fundamental rights against innovation and competition here in the EU?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I feel like there is a very here. Well, I'd say in general, in Europe, we have a very hard time to actually transform our regulation into market differentiation points. The problem is that we are seeing constraints as something that only kind of doesn't allow us to go as far and fast as, for example, we would do without the regulation. However, it actually, working under constraint is something that usually allows for more innovation. However, the problem is that the regulation doesn't come with sufficient funding in Europe, and this is a general problem, because if you are looking at the companies such as Mistral, for example, and if you are looking at the funding that they got, the private one, it's almost fully American venture capital. And there is completely no incentive for the American venture capitalist to actually say to Mistral, guys, it really does make sense to you in order to expand in the European market to actually be the champions of following the regulation, which is not that difficult. I want to really insist on that, specifically for generative AI, being compliant with the current AI Act, not training on copyrighted data, not training on personal data, and to bring in place some of the guardrails which AI Act does impose, as well as Digital Service Act, is not that much of a difficulty. However, what is your incentive to do so if the market that you are actually targeting in the end of the day is the American one? because your investors, they actually can put you in many more contact with the American industry and push you there than actually Europe. Well, there is no incentive. And the same situation happens all over again when you look at some of the mechanisms of European funding. When you look at the EIC scheme, if you are looking at horizons and all of these kind of things, we don't actually have sufficient incentives for European startups to actually say, yes, if I'm compliant with regulation, I will get more funding. No, it's just basically it's non-existent. And we have regulation, which mostly actually, which will in the end of the day be applied to the ones who are implementing AI systems. And this is a good thing. However, there is no incentives for the providers to actually be compliant. And this is why, for example, now Meta simply for their last release of Llama models, they simply don't release it in Europe. That's all, because there is no incentive. So I think that Mario Draghi could be in some ways right, but I just don't think that it's the regulation that stops European actors from thriving, but the lack of concrete mechanisms of funding for actually incentivizing economic actors to follow with the regulation on multiple levels. And we have this with green transition. We have this kind of incentives on many levels for companies to actually not only follow, but to innovate and to propose solutions which are in line with their ecological imperatives. And even if it's, I mean, we still have lots of work to do on that level, but there are mechanisms on this. And there is little to nothing when it comes to the AI field. So I think that the regulator here should be a little bit more probably proactive and a little bit more Keynesian in its understanding of how to actually boost the field without renouncing to the very reasonable, once again, reasonable ideas which we need to implement to protect not only the human rights, but also the actually some of the very basic economic rules. I mean, it's normal that we do respect copyright because it does respect the right to the property of the copyright holders. I mean, it's there is nothing that crazy about it. So well, probably an answer which let's say doesn't make us go much further, but this is at least the feeling that I was getting from the field lately.
I appreciate that, Anastasia. And I'm sure we could have a whole conversation about this outside of this theme as well on your remarks. Certainly a lot to take away from that and to think about as well in the European context. But while we're on this note of really kind of practical mechanisms, I do have one concluding question, and this is for Corinne. And this will be our last question before we move into the Q&A period with our audience. But Corinne, so noting that the CIIDP's goals in advancing a rights kind of based implementation of the EU AI Act in particular, I'm curious how you see mechanisms like the Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment as future-proof instruments for ensuring the protection of fundamental rights. And then as we await kind of the official assessment, what kind of features would you like to see in such an assessment to avoid it becoming a mere checklist, but rather an actual practical tool for ensuring fundamental rights are considered throughout the AI's life cycle?
So again, answering this question is quite a challenge, but let's try. And I would like to react to some of the comments that have been made as well by the other speakers. So first, I would like to state that for the fundamental right impact assessments, which is, for example, will be used for public administrations, and other human rights impact assessment that we find in the EU Act, so for developers of high-risk AI systems or for providers of general-purpose AI models. For them to be considered as a mere checklist would be actually a victory, because it would mean that human rights protection by design and through AI use has been integrated and internalized in the development and deployment of AI systems. But here, to see what is at stake, I would like to take some examples. What are we talking about with? I would take more globally the category of human rights impact assessment, because as I mentioned, there are several in the EU Act. We talked about education. Emotional recognition in education is actually prohibited under the AI Act. However, are considered high-risk AI systems warranting a human rights impact assessment under Article 9 of the EU Act, are use of AI development of AI system in the field of education and vocational training, with regard to determining access to education and admissions, evaluating learning outcomes, or monitoring prohibited behaviors. All these AI practices would require a human rights impact assessment. And here I would like to link it to the issue of AI literacy, because we mentioned AI literacy for the general publication, but I would like to highlight again that there are AI literacy obligations in the AI Act, which will enter into force in February 2025. So providers and deployers of AI systems shall take measure to ensure a sufficient level of AI literacy of their staff and other persons dealing with the operation and use of AI system on their behalf, taking into account their technical knowledge, experience, education, and training, and the context the AI systems are to be used in, and considering the person or groups of persons on whom the AI systems are to be used. And I think that these AI literacy obligations for companies also participate in a human-centric culture in the development and use of AI, and are key in transforming human rights impact assessment as something more than a checklist. So to be future-proof, just the key points here. I think that data protection impact assessment, which we already know in Europe and practice regularly, should be integrated into fundamental rights impact assessment and other human rights impact assessment, because issues can come as much from the data used from the design and functioning of the AI systems, because issues can come as much from the data used as from the design and functioning of the AI systems. So there is experience with regard to a rights-based approach to technological developments and consequence on citizens' daily lives. And just to tell you why this is so important, because the approach matters, and there is a common approach between human rights impact assessment and data protection impact assessment. First, the approach is ex ante. Second, there is a rights-based focus of the assessment conducted. Third, there is supposed to be an iterative structure. Also, there is also, for the two kinds of assessment, there is 3 steps to be respected in the analysis: risk identification, analysis and evaluation, and prevention and mitigation. And there is also a necessary contextual analysis. So what are the characteristics of the AI system used? Rachel mentioned that, the context of use, and the categories of person affected. To be future-proofed, human rights impact assessment should address the why, the what, and the how. I think these are the 3 characteristics that we should have. As for the why, and we don't hear that so much when we talk about human rights impact assessment, the question are, is there a need to use an AI-based system, and are there alternative solutions? Were non-automated process considered? Why a preference for automation, and what are the consequences of not using AI? If AI is deemed necessary, were different kinds of AI systems considered? For example, deterministic system versus probabilistic systems, because we know that with deterministic systems, we have much less the issue of the black box, which we have allegedly with probabilistic systems. And this same question should be asked at the end of the impact assessment process, based on potential impact, alternative solutions which entail lower risks while achieving the desired outcome. And of course, we do think that at the end of this why question, there should be a termination obligation if there is a significant risk to human rights. As for the what, David talked about it already. This concerns the description of the systems, data collection and processing, erasure, transparency, and as mentioned, it is not just informational transparency and documentation. Yes, it's important, but the key part is to plug in the GDPR, as mentioned by David, with the provisions on algorithmic transparency and understanding the logics of the system, because it is key for contestability. If there is a concrete issue that shows up and someone is affected, in order to contest the outcome, we need to know where the problem comes from. So we need to understand the logic of the system and also data quality and governance. And as for the how, I think the key points are risk analysis and management, stakeholder participation, and human oversight. Here, the analysis of the level of impact on fundamental rights is key. And I would like to remind something to everyone. We don't, and I think David hinted to it as well, we don't have only the EUA Act, we have other legislation with regard, for example, discrimination. We have the entire EU law acquis. So let's remind everyone that violation of human rights is simply not acceptable. It is a red line. We are supposed to respect existing laws, for example, with regard to discrimination. And we have then to assess the acceptability of risks based on likelihood and severity. And a last very important point is an analysis based on existing rights. We can take the Charter of Fundamental Rights, we can take national constitution and charters. This is very, very important because it would ensure the future-proof character of the assessment. And we should not ignore rights, which maybe, as of now, have not been activated. And I would like to conclude by taking an example. We talked about disinformation in the context of elections, manipulative and deceptive use of AI. But here, there is a right which could be very handy, which has not been so much activated so far, which is freedom of thought. Citizens should have freedom of thought and should not be submitted to disinformation in the context of election, or they should not be manipulated by submitted to a manipulative or deceptive use of AI. So this is an example of right which we should check out in the future. And of course, all the different rights such as non-discrimination, access to remedies, etc., should be ensured. I will conclude by what I started. The same rights shall be ensured online and offline, online as much as offline. Then the key tasks for now will be how we interpret it in order for the potential of new technologies to be unleashed for the good of all.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I think that's a really wonderful note for us to conclude the panel questions at this time. I am taking a look through the audience Q&As, and I do see a lot coming up about the fundamental rights impact assessment. And Corinne, you've already kind of alluded to the compatibility that it has with these data protection impact assessments as well. So I just want to let everybody know EIPA is actually going to be offering a workshop on this particular subject at the end of October. So if you have any questions about that, you can check out our website on that. But I do want to make sure that we have the chance to answer some of the audience Q&As. We have some limited time here, but I do see two in particular that I think would be particularly interesting to address. And what I think I'm going to do is, just on the nature of these questions, I'm going to divvy them up between our panel. So I see one here from Bruna. And I think this one's probably best targeted towards Anastasia and Andy. And then I also see one of our most upvoted ones, which is an anonymous attendee that I think would be more well suited for David and Karine. So what I'll start is with the question, perhaps with Andy and Anastasia. The question here is, there's a lot of focus on preventing harms to fundamental rights, but very little on what to do when harms actually occur. How can we ensure effective remedies for AI-related fundamental rights harms? For example, Article 27, which keeps coming up, the FRIA should include the measures to be taken in the case of materialization of risks. So Andy, do you want to go ahead there and jump in with an answer to this question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think that this is a very salient and challenging question that it really shapes a lot of the discussion around this issue. One of the things that I think is critical and that Corinne brought up very importantly was the different stakeholders that are involved and how they're involved. And I think that that's involving them throughout the design process, because right, when we think about these problems having occurred in the work, having occurred in, in social settings, part of the problem is that it originated earlier. So when we think about handling it, part of that is really involving stakeholders from the beginning and really thinking about their impacts. But I think it's also their response when these problems have occurred is trying to understand what does justice look like in this kind of dynamic, because the rights that we're talking about, because they're in digital spaces, are often in the way we discuss them and the way we think about them abstracted. They're divorced from the offline world, from the physical world, as the point Corinne made a couple times and very well, I think. And so I think having those negotiations and discussions with the people who have been wronged is critical in responding to them, and not approaching these either the protections or the responses from a strictly technical perspective. Is, in my opinion, instrumental in having a meaningful response and in addressing these.
Thank you so much, Andy. And Anastasia, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the same question.
Well, I think that obviously, the regulator on the more national levels or in European level will come up with more precise, let's say, not fine system, but that's quite obvious that there are many more provisions to come after the AI Act on the specific ways to deal with the harm. But I just want to make one step back and talk about the fact that we would actually need to have much more robust evaluation systems for AI, because the issue here is when we are talking about the harm done to people based on the decisions made with AI systems involved. In very short term, it will be very difficult to understand which exact part of AI system was responsible for what, specifically in more agentic environments. And as we are going towards more diverse presence of AI system providers, we do really need to have more refined and granular evaluation frameworks, and this is something that doesn't simply exist at the moment. The very basic cases that we had, for example, in the Netherlands, where you had some kind of very simple algorithmic system integrated to their social security, if I'm not mistaken, social security system, where you basically have the algorithm given a sort of a pre-decision when it comes to person's situation, and many people get refused their rights to social security payments for wrong reasons, which had lots of harm. But when it comes to more sophisticated systems, where you have one system dealing with, I don't know, for example, processing of citizens' documents, when you have another one, for example, given the synthesis of these documents to the public servant who then makes a decision, these kind of situations are not accounted for at the moment. It's really it's more difficult to get through this, and I really think that there is a strong need for robust evaluation systems coming from the regulator, which are not only implemented on the enterprise or on different administration levels.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. I think that leaves us very, very brief time for the last question. I'm going to ask my panelists to be as quick as possible on this, but one remaining question is that it appears that the global momentum seems to be pushing towards AI safety more than fundamental rights, hence dictating to some extent where efforts and resources go. We see countries creating their own national strategy for AI institutes, and there will be an upcoming international network conference on AI safety institutes to be hosted by the United States. How can the EU ensure that fundamental rights are integrated into global AI safety cooperation? Corinne, I'm going to send this to you very quickly, and then we'll conclude with David if we could. Thank you.
Well, my only answer will be that it is collective efforts with CSOs, with institutional partners, with everyone, to ensure that we don't end up with mere interoperability, but upward convergence. This is an ongoing process. There is no definite answer yet, but the current process going on at EU level for the implementation of the EU AI Act will be key. That will be the quickest answer I can give.
Thank you. David, do you want to wrap it up?
Thank you. I'll try. I mean, for the sake of time, I shamelessly refer on this question to our mandate limitations on external cooperation. So we focus on fundamental rights protection within the EU, but of course hope for a Brussels effect there. Just to use meaningfully the last seconds, I probably have, I just chip in on this other question. I mean, first we need to look into the risks and then discuss the mitigation, and I'm afraid that we are not yet there. And of course, we need to start with creating transparency, identifying the risks, and then see how we can go about it. And the AI Act is one issue, but of course we still have other oversights. We still have courts they're all there to ensure that fundamental rights are protected. So it's a common effort that we go further, and we will learn a lot in the next years about how AI systems work and function, and in some areas it may be fine to use, in others not so. So exciting times ahead.
Thank you so much. And I think that officially concludes this panel discussion on protecting fundamental rights in an era of artificial intelligence. If I may, I just want to wrap up with some concluding comments about today's session, where we heard time and time again about this idea of human in the loop and human oversight, and how crucial this is of creating human-centric artificial intelligence. We also talked a lot about kind of the interplay and the overlap between notions of responsible AI and data protection, and what this interplay between the EU AI Act and the GDPR might yield as we move forward. Most interestingly, though, we had a lot of conversation revolving around AI literacy and the importance of establishing AI literacy for empowering citizens and users to be able to use AI responsibly and to benefit from it equally. And in this regard, EIPA is working very hard to be able to develop opportunities to enhance AI literacy, specifically amongst public institutions, but across the public as well. So we do have some courses relating to artificial intelligence happening here in October. We invite everyone to participate. But most importantly, and I would just want to conclude with these ideas of interdisciplinary, the idea of bringing folks together and having meaningful conversations to contribute to impactful and practical kind of solutions to fundamental rights violations and risks and harms. And on that note, I can't think of a better panel that truly represents so much diversity. And I really want to thank you all again so much for your contributions. And for joining us, and for our audience as well who tuned in during their lunch hour. Wishing you all the very best, and thanks again.